most of the companies that VCs invest in don't end up being certainly not unicorns, maybe not even successul.
But there's much more than luck involved. But there's some things you can't control is how I would put it.
Don't worry about the great deals you miss. You're going to miss a lot.
We invested in a great company that their entire industry went to zero overnight. You can foresee that and you can control that.
It's a tough job, being an entrepreneur. I mean, they know that going into it, but you don't really know it until you actually do it. You can have a great hand if the guy to your right has pocket aces, then there may not be any way to get through that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Matan Hazanov. Today, I have a very unique and special guest, Geoff Simonette. Geoff, unlike many of the entrepreneurs and successful investors that I speak to, Geoff fell into starting a business accidentally, became very successful, built a business, sold it, and became a prolific venture capital investor, investing in dozens of companies. I think any entrepreneur or investor will get tremendous value from listening to what Geoff has to say. Geoff, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So walk us through your background. How did you get into entrepreneurship? Where did you start off?
It was a bit accidental. There was never a plan. I did a commerce degree at Queen's long ago in the late 80s, early 90s. So I don't remember there being a lot of talk about being an entrepreneur at the time. You know, people went through and became brand managers and went the investment banking route or accounting. Or my plan was actually to go to law school, and so I didn't go through the recruiting process at Queen's. I did my LSAT. I applied. I got into law school, but in the late time in my last year at Queen's, I got offered a job at a resort in Huntsville, which is where I grew up, to run all of the recreation at a resort, including a small golf course. Sounded fantastic, so I took the job, and unfortunately, it didn't last too long. Early 90s, resorts weren't doing that well. It was kind of a new position. I was there for a few months. I got laid off, decided not to go back to law school. Instead, I briefly helped my parents, who were teachers for a long time. They bought a sports store in the late 70s. And I helped them for a while set up a silk screening business in the basement of their store. They already had the store. They were selling shirts, but they weren't printing their own. And a lot of teams were doing business there. So that was sort of a taste of doing my own business, although it was for and funded by my parents at the time.
How old were you when all this was happening?
I would have been 22, so right at the end of university. I did that for a while, but I was always planning on just setting that up and moving on, and didn't have a real plan at this point. So I was traveling around southern Ontario, mostly hitchhiking. I'm not sure I'd do that now, but visiting friends who were still in university. In my stop in Toronto, I was visiting a friend who was working at a very small software development company. And since I hadn't gone through the recruiting process, I had with me still a 5 1/4-inch floppy, and I'm really dating myself here, a floppy disk, and they're big back then, with partly done resume, and asked her if I could borrow a computer. So I went to her office with her, met the owner of her company, which was also a Queen's Commerce grad, 10 years older than myself. He asked me out for lunch. We chatted for a while. He asked me to come and help him with his company, help him grow it, and I wasn't doing anything else, so I said, sure, why not?
So you never saw yourself becoming an entrepreneur when you were growing up?
No, not really. Like I said, both my parents were teachers. I was possibly one of the routes. I wasn't really even that fully aware of those opportunities, but joined the IT company. They were very entrepreneurial. Did a number of years of helping them grow. We really got into Lotus Notes. Again, I'm dating myself. Then I kind of got tired of the hourly working for, tracking your hours, charging by the hour. I left. I went traveling for a year, but I kept in touch with the company and said I'd come back if I could start a software product company within the company. So I had the ability to start a company while still working for a bigger company and still getting paid. So it was a chance to be an entrepreneur, but with very, very little risk.
It's like starting a new division type thing?
It was like starting a new division, a small company. The whole thing was small at the time, but yeah, starting a new division and building that and hiring a team and all the things that entrepreneurs go through. But at the time, I had a salary and it was funded by the company. I had to meet goals, and it wasn't just a blank check, but it was a fairly riskless way of becoming an entrepreneur.
That's interesting. Why didn't you go back and just become a lawyer after, the whole resort thing?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I just after the resort finished, I was thinking about going to be a lawyer or going to law school. I'm not sure. I guess at the time I wasn't even sure what the process to reapply was. My parents needed some help. I did that. Looked like a good time to maybe go traveling, which is where I started in Ontario, and then just kind of fell into the company is called United System Solutions.
Interesting. So your parents were both teachers, and they started a sports goods retailer?
Yeah, they were both teachers, and that kind of taught me early on. I was great what they were doing. They were both phys ed teachers, come from a sporting background.
That makes sense.
But I looked at that, I thought, yeah, I like what they're doing. It's interesting. I like teachers. But then what you're going to make, what you're going to do for your whole career. And that kind of didn't sit well with me. So I knew I didn't want to be a teacher. But they also worked at a camp in the summer, which is what brought us to Huntsville. They took a year off of teaching to work at the camp full time, which is where I lived for a few years. Then decided living at a camp wasn't the greatest thing for them, but they loved Huntsville, so they bought a sports store. And my dad became an entrepreneur, I guess, when he was 51, so he wasn't young, with a sports store in a small town.
What did you think about it? I mean, do you remember when they made that transition? Like, what did you think about that?
Yeah, I was pretty young. They bought the store when I was 9 years old. I was 9 years old and I played a lot of sports. I just thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Access to sporting equipment, easy. So I'm not sure it was a great choice for them. I mean, they liked doing it, but it's a tough grind running a store in a small town. In the winter, you might have 0 customers, but you're still there and open. So, but from my point of view, access to new shoes and, posters and all the things a 9-year-old might like.
So you travel around, you interact with someone that was an alumnus of Queen's, which is your alma mater, right?
Yeah.
Queen's is one of the best universities in Canada, especially for commerce. I think it's important context for people that aren't from here.
Good to hear. My son's there now.
Oh, that's great. I know when I was trying to get into university, it was really 3 major schools in Canada for business. You had Schulich, you had Queen's, and Ivy at Western. Yeah. Right. So you meet this. By
the way, I have one child in Ivy and one in Queens. So
okay, good. Now you got to get one into Schulich, and you're good.
I've got a third, so we'll see.
That's amazing. So it's interesting because most people in your position would just go get some corporate job or some job making whatever the equivalent of $50,000 a year is today. But you decided to start this division within the software company. How did you make that leap? Because that's it's less risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, remember I did 4 years just with the software company, helping them build a Lotus Notes business before I left and came back. So I liked the people, I liked what they were doing. It was interesting. I just didn't love always knowing you're tracking your hourly time and you're only as good as your time. The work was good, the customers were great, but I didn't see it as a long-term thing for me. But they were very open to ideas. They liked, we had built CRM, we didn't call it CRM, but CRM-like solutions multiple times for different customers as custom jobs. And it just seemed to me we could just take our best one we've done, fix it up a bit, build a little team around it, and create an actual product. So as I mentioned, I kept in touch with them while I was traveling. They were keen to the idea, gave me an opportunity to own a little piece of this as well. And it sounded like a great opportunity. That's
great. So it's not an uncommon story that I see around in the entrepreneurial world where you do professional services, you're building products for other customers, software and whatever. And then you just said, hey, this is actually really popular. Let's productize it and then go sell it, right? Seems like a good
I run into that frequently and help companies with that as well. And it's not an easy thing. It sounds easy, but your company, a lot of the people in your company like doing what they're doing. And having a product side to it is perhaps a distraction for the real business. Maybe the product side is taking resources away from the rest of the business. It's certainly taking money away from the rest of the business while the product side builds up. So there's a push and pull, and it's a different mindset to build a product than it is to do custom development all the time. So it's not easy, but I think it's a great transition because building something once and selling it 1 million times is far more scalable than constant hourly work.
So you build this division within this bigger company.
Yeah.
I understand you eventually got to about 150 employees. you guys sold it to Cognicase, right?
The whole business got
right.
to somewhere north of 120. I can't remember exactly. It might have been 150. So we had the original business, which was still mostly doing custom software development. We had the product company. We had a training center that we opened downtown Adelaide and Young area, which was mostly training in Lotus Notes related things, some Microsoft tools. And briefly, we had sort of a .com that I would say was never really fully formed. But we sold them all to Cognicase in 2001, and Cognicase got purchased, taken over by CGI, I think, in 2003.
Okay. So in those intervening years, like you helped build this, you're a significant part of building this business.
Yeah.
What were some major lessons you learned in terms of building products, the software, really when it was quite nascent?
Yeah, well, a lot of things. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, when we built the product, we had done many versions of this before. We had a great team. I was able to get some of the best resources we had from our company on the product team. We were naive to building a company and to selling a product, and we thought if we build this, the world will come and buy it. And of course, that's not how it works. So we built the product and then realized we had to learn how to sell and how to market. And it was a steep learning curve. And also, building a product means before we were doing custom solutions, and they were all different, and we didn't maintain them. As soon as you have a product, you can't get too far off the track on any one customer customizing, because then it's hard to maintain, and you always want to focus on the central piece. So, there's a lot of things that are different than having a custom development shop that we learned along the way, and it took time and money, but we got there.
Right. And do you have any insight into why selling at that point, like in 2001? I imagine it's after the .com crash. Like, why sell then? Why sell at all? Why not just keep going?
Yeah, by that time, there were really 5 people who owned most of the companies. The 2 originals owned most of it. We all had our different reasons for staying or not staying. I wouldn't say necessarily we were all on the same page. We had seen a lot of exits in the previous years, and having been through the whole .com thing at the time, we're thinking, people are making a lot of money. There's crazy valuations, but there's not a lot of substance behind some of these things that we're seeing. Like, why would anyone do it? So we kind of talked ourselves out of that. But we had a business; it was doing well. We didn't sell during the .com boom, where probably what we did sell could have been worth a lot more. But Cognicase was on an acquisition spree and looking at a lot of companies. It was a good offer. It looked interesting for our company and another step forward. And I'd been doing it for 10 years. The founders had been there for 15. And collectively, we just decided it was a good time to step off.
Mm-hmm. So what happened after that? You sold. You joined. You joined the Cognicase and the corporate. How was that different than running kind of like a startup?
Well, as I say, there was 5 of us, and we had different roles. And Cognicase bought a number of companies, and we were one of the bigger ones in Toronto at the time. And part of our job was sort of integrating them all together under the Cognicase banner. However, because we had started the product company, I was sort of off on the side, continuing to run the product company, and didn't deal too much with the integration. So I was able to keep doing what I was doing, which was good. But I was part of the bigger Cognicase machine. It was a different culture, a different way of doing things. It wasn't really for me. We actually had a 3-year earnout. So I learned a lot about structuring deals at the time, but we had a 3-year earnout. And about a year into it, the folks at Cognicase had a different vision of where they wanted to go with our product company than we did, and we renegotiated our earnouts, kind of like selling it again to the same people. And I left after about a year, as did my partner in the product company, who was part of the group of 5. We both left in about a year. Just decided. Specifically, Cognicase at that time wasn't a great fit for where we wanted to go. And this was before it was taken over by CGI, so I was never actually part of CGI. The rest of the company was months after that.
So after you left Cognicase, you started to invest in companies, right? Walk me through why did you decide to become an investor and where you started?
Well, first I went traveling again for a little while. And then I came back and yeah, I'd made some money. I was a part owner of United System Solutions. I was 31 at the time. Spent a year at Cognicase, so 32 by the time I left. I wasn't really interested in going and finding a job if I didn't have to. So in my interactions with some of the other people that left United, as well as other people we met along the way, we ran into some opportunities to invest in companies. I learned about what angel investing was at the time and the angel groups in Toronto. I joined the Toronto Angel Group, which shortly thereafter, I don't know, a year or two later, became the Maple Leaf Angels, which is still up and running today and one of the more active angel groups in the Toronto area. So actually, I was a founding member of the Maple Leaf Angels, which really just meant I was there at the time because I didn't do a lot of the founding. I watched a lot of these deals. I don't think I ever invested with the angels at the time, but just through my own network, I ran into some interesting opportunities, and I liked the companies. I liked what they were doing. I had some background in building a company and the technology space, so it was just sort of a natural fit.
Mm-hmm. And you also co-founded Greensky, right? Which is a pretty well-known VC in Toronto today.
Yeah.
We've co-invested with them. They're great. But walk us through how you got to that point to co-founding what became a venture firm. But I know it didn't start off that way, yeah.
Yeah, so I was angel investing. I did a couple of other things in between. I met a person who together we decided let's start a company and help. Maybe we'll do transactions in the mid-market. He came from the private equity world, buyouts, large buyouts, large companies, large dollars. I came from the startup world. We thought we'd find deals somewhere in between. This is now around 2007, 2008. There were also financial troubles in the world, as you may know. So we spent a while working on this, did a few things, but found it difficult to find meaningful jobs for us to work on. He decided to go back to a real job, and I liked what I was doing, and I still had some freedom and time. So I decided to continue doing what we were doing, but go back to what I was better at, which is working with early stage tech companies. Along the way, we met Mike List and his law firm and partnered with him and moved into his offices. That's how Greensky began. So Mike and I continued on after my original partner left. Mm-hmm. And we started focusing on early stage tech companies. And at the time, we were helping them grow, helping them raise capital. We were an exempt market dealer. And not a VC at the time, and did that for many years, met lots of interesting companies, some that have done well, some that did not. We were typically investing our own dollars, not a fund, but just our own money in the deals and money that we had accumulated in Greensky. Sometimes getting warrants as well in the transactions. You
were involved in wave accounting, right?
Yeah, so when I decided to go back to early stage tech companies, the first one I met through a friend of mine was Wave Accounting, early days for them. So this would have been around 2010. And I worked with them on their financial model and their deck and their strategy and helped them with their original angel investors and helped them with their first VC, which was Omers.
Right, Geoff Ventures, which was, I think, their first investment was.
Was their first investment. And at the time, one of the partners of Omers was Peter Koresha. Mm-hmm. And he happened to previously be, he had a position at Lotus. And because of my days at United System Solutions, we worked with Lotus Notes, and we met Peter many times. I knew him from his Lotus days. He had left and worked with Omers to start up their fund. I'm not sure I even knew about that at the time. Coincidentally, Omers was across the road on University Avenue from Greensky. I was just going to lunch one day. I ran into Peter, hadn't seen him for a long time, told him what I was doing, said I was working with Wave and they were looking to raise capital. And he asked me about it and he said, "That's interesting. I'm working at a fund and we're looking for SaaS software companies." And some time passed, but I believe it was Omer's first investment was in Wave Accounting.
Right, and it was a good one. What was their exit? They sold for like
Yeah,
several hundred
they
million?
sold for, I think north of 500 million to H&R Block many years later. But yeah, it was a good exit for all involved.
Yeah, that's great. So how do you evaluate the potential? So this was back when you were doing more advising and that type
Yeah.
of thing, but you eventually went into investing directly into many dozens of companies. How do you evaluate the potential of a startup, not only for aspiring venture capital investors out there, but for entrepreneurs that are looking to raise capital? What should they exemplify? What should they do? How should they prepare? By what's your standard? What are you looking for?
Yeah, I invested in a bunch as an angel investor before Greensky, and actually as a passive investor, my track record wasn't that great. There's a learning curve.
Mhm.
Usually in the investment world, when anyone says, I learned a lot, that means I lost some money, which I
Yeah.
did.
I've learned a lot as well.
Yeah, keep learning. We did a bunch through Greensky, and then I continued on after, which we'll talk about. I mean, at a broad level, the things that I'm looking for are the same things that you would have in your typical pitch deck, and there's a reason for that, I guess.
Mhm.
But I like a company that has a very clear value proposition. That there's a big market, that they have the ability to sell to that market. They have some kind of unique either intellectual property or some advantage, some competitive advantage that they can last for a while. I mean, these are kind of standard things. And of course, a great management team. And for us at Greensky, because we were writing our own checks into the companies we were working with, we had the opportunity to work with them for a while because usually they were engaging us to help them through the process of raising capital. So we would see all these things. I'd help them build their financial model, and a lot of thinking and a lot of assumptions have to go into the financial model. So I'd have to dig into all of that. I'd also learn if they were coachable or not at the time. Of course, we'd have to learn all about their product, and we would see their early traction and their early customers. So this process of working with them was kind of a paid due diligence, not always paid, sometimes paid, which would lead us to and a relationship building with the entrepreneur. And for me, I mean, you have to have a great relationship with the entrepreneur and also some connection to what it is that they're doing. I mean, lots of people are doing interesting things. Some things I don't know anything about or I'm not that interested in, I probably wouldn't invest. So, if they were passionate about what they were doing and it sort of checked all those boxes I was talking about and we worked well together and they were willing to take our advice, then we would likely both write a check and bring in our network.
What would you say is there a most important characteristic when you're looking at an investment?
Well, a most important characteristic. So I also should say that I typically work in the seed stage and before there's any venture capital. And, it is very difficult to pick winners really early on in the process. Most important by far is management. I'd rather... You get enamored by really interesting intellectual property. Someone's built a better mousetrap. You see what they're doing and think that's fascinating. It's fantastic. I didn't know we could even do that. But you'd rather have a great management team and a mediocre idea than a great idea with a bad management team. So, I mean, everybody says that it is true management. Most of the companies that I've invested in the past, by the time they've either exited or even really got to stride, they're probably not doing the same thing as when I met them in the first place. Not entirely different, but there's probably some kind of pivot in there. So having people who can work through unknown, through adversity, and come out the other side is really what you're looking for.
Right. It's one of the most challenging things I find in venture capitals, evaluating entrepreneurs.
Yep.
Is it just exposure to them for a long period of time? Because it seems like you work with most of the ones you work with before investing.
Yeah.
Is it just that, or is there another way to do it? Like if you're just doing diligence without working with them?
I mean, there is the advantage we had was we worked with them for a while, but and of course, venture capital firms will work and do due diligence for a long time in their companies, but they have a fund to deploy and perhaps not the same amount of time and flexibility that I had. Same with angel investors. I mean, they can spend time doing it, but often they'll follow a group into an investment and maybe haven't spent that time. So there was an advantage there. But I mean, if you haven't done that, I mean, of course, you want to look at whether they've had experience doing this before.
Mm-hmm.
how their level of confidence in what they're doing, their passion for it, how committed they are to it, both financially and just day-to-day effort, which you can tell along the way if they're, as I mentioned before, if they're coachable or not. Even if you're not their coach, you want to make sure that they're open to ideas and changes. I mean, I love entrepreneurs, if you can tell, that are able to make decisions with uncertainty around them, which is a difficult thing to do. It's one of the hardest things for people starting up a company. They have to make decisions all the time. They involve money. They involve whether the company survives or not. And nobody really wants to make those decisions, but that is being an entrepreneur.
What are some common mistakes you see founders making when starting a business or raising venture capital?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I think, as we all know, that a lot of businesses fail, startups, is because there is no bar to being an entrepreneur. Anyone can do it. Not everybody should do it. Not everybody has the skills or the personality or the perseverance to be an entrepreneur. So what are the skills? The question is, what are the skills that they should have in order to...
Or what are some common mistakes they make?
Mistakes they make, yeah. Well, as I just mentioned a minute ago, one of the things I find is they have difficulty making decisions. And you want to do everything you can as an entrepreneur in order to make that and other things you have to do easier. So I think, they don't necessarily map out a real plan. And I don't necessarily mean a 24-page business plan that they write once, hand to an investor, and never look at again. But building, I'm a finance guy, I'm a numbers guy. I prefer them to build a very strong financial model where they have to think through all of their assumptions. They have to think through when they're going to do certain things, how they're going to spend their money, and using this not just as a tool for investors, but on a day-to-day basis to run their business. Because when you're an entrepreneur and you don't have much money, and you have to decide every day, okay, should I hire that person? Should I do this marketing campaign? Should I buy a new computer? They're all hard decisions to make. You don't want to spend your money, but you want to grow your business. When you plan it all out for a year and say, okay, here's all the things we should do, and here's how much money it's going to take, and okay, I have a pathway to get that money, then you kind of made all those decisions in advance, and now you're just executing. It doesn't mean that you won't revisit each one of those when you get there, because you may not have been generating as much revenue as you thought. Maybe your hires from before didn't work out, but you're constantly updating and managing your plan, your financial model, which alleviates your ability to make decisions as you move along. Like, you've made the decisions, now just go and execute on them. So that's one example. If they often don't have the plan, they don't have the next 12 months mapped out. I would say other mistakes they make are not firing people early enough. That's kind of a negative thing. But entrepreneurs, they're working in a small group. They get to know each other really well. They're loyal people. They don't want to make those hard decisions either. But usually when they know it has to be made and they put it off for a long time, when finally they part ways with somebody, they'll look back almost all the time and say, I should have done that sooner. Running out of money is,
that's the
cardinal mistake.
Don't run out of money. That's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, and the problem is people, even if they plan well, they know it's coming, but you have to realize that the process of solving that problem, whether it's raising equity capital or something else, is time consuming. Like, you need to think about this well in advance. It's not only time consuming, it takes your eye off the ball, but it just takes time. So, you can work backwards from a deal and think about all the stages you have to go through. And there's months involved in raising capital. You're raising capital. You know how that goes.
Oh, yeah. It's very challenging. Not the first time, too.
Yeah.
So one of the characteristics I found in entrepreneurs that separates great founders from either mediocre or terrible ones is the ability to hire other great people and to sell them on a vision, get them to work for equity or for much below market salary, inspiring them, to work crazy hours and all that stuff. It's just somebody who's like that is quite rare. I found it to be if they can bring on a good stable of people around them, other exceptional people, that's an entrepreneur that can really make it.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that? Has that been something?
Oh, for sure. I mean, and really what that means is they have to be doing something meaningful that they're passionate about, that solves a real problem, because other people will buy into that message, that energy, and will want to be part of it. Which does mean you have to have a vision of where this is all going, and again, model that out so that you can share that. Everybody's always selling. As an entrepreneur, you may not consider yourself a salesman, but you're always selling, whether it's to investors, it's to new hires. And by selling, I don't mean pushing something that people don't want. I mean communicating your vision of why this is great and why you want to be a part of it. And there's lots of people who will take a risk with the right person that can communicate their vision and make people understand. And it is a real skill, because you're probably, as tech entrepreneurs, you may be doing something very complicated. And when you're talking to either new employees or investors, it's not so much about the science. It's all about what problem are you solving and why. And, with somebody who's really passionate about what they're doing, they can bring in those people.
Right. Have you ever been so sure of an investment or entrepreneur and just completely disappointed by their lack of success?
Yeah, everyone that didn't work out.
That's a good answer. Yeah. Exactly right.
I was probably very sure about all of them. No, that's not entirely true. I mean, I've made some investments for the wrong reasons, just, blindly following somebody because I didn't spend the time myself, or somebody I trusted who may not have been that close to the business. Mm-hmm. I do find angel investors would and should and most often do their due diligence, but often people make investments because a group is doing it, because someone they trust is doing it, because they're afraid of missing out on something, a really good deal. So, you don't always go through all the right steps. And even when you do, who knows, for a lot of these, there is quite a bit of luck and timing involved in making those right decisions. So yeah, lots of them I was convinced were great. And, I would have modified my view on the world with some of the lessons that I learned along the way. And others, who knew? And, would I have been able to tell later? I'm not sure. So I lost my money, but didn't necessarily learn anything.
Can you share one of those learnings after an investment didn't go right and say, I'm not going to make a decision that way again?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think if it's that black and white. I mean, I've certainly made some bets, as I mentioned actually before. I made some bets on what looked like really impressive intellectual property, but maybe not the right person to take it to where it needed to go. Mm-hmm. Done that a few times actually, and I'm as a former entrepreneur, one of the mistakes I make is I look at a company and think, well, I can step in and help them do this, or I can make this happen, but it's not my job. I don't have the time to make them happen, and maybe I can't anyway. I don't know. I might be deluding myself. But you look at, sometimes you overlook some of the problems that because you just think, they'll do it the same way I would do it, or I can help them get through it. But I've certainly invested in companies that had probably a real science backing and cool intellectual property that maybe I didn't understand, and not the right team to move it along. I would also say I've invested in companies where management may not have been as committed as they should be. I've had less luck, and I don't want to draw a broad paintbrush over any group of people, but less luck with younger entrepreneurs. And I think to myself that, well, they know if they fail, they learned a lot and they can just move on, and which is great, and they should do that. Whereas some of the older entrepreneurs, and by older, I don't mean old, I mean 30s, 40s maybe, who have other commitments. They're fully committed to this. They can't afford to make it lose, and mm-hmm. and they find and they might have some more experience as well, and they find ways to make it work.
Right. That's one of those memes that go around that people think, like everyone's Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
When they raise money, they're like out of Harvard or something and 22 years old. Most funded entrepreneurs and most successful startup entrepreneurs are in their 30s and 40s. They're people with a decade plus of industry experience. Okay. They know what they're doing. And so that's something most people don't realize. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know the stats on that, but I've certainly personally experienced that. Not to say that there aren't some fantastic young entrepreneurs, but there is some luck involved in that too. So I have had better luck. And even things I've found along the way, like a husband and wife team or brothers might be fantastic, But then there's other things in the mix that perhaps might not make for a good long-term relationship. It's not that I wouldn't, and I have invested in a husband and wife team, but I think more about relationships like that in a company.
Yeah, there's actually quite a split view on this. I'm not sure about husband and wife teams. My gut instinct tells me that it's a much riskier bet because now it's not just about them as business partners, it's them as a couple. And if something happens to them as a couple, aside from the fact that you're literally with them all day, not just because you're living with them, but you're also at work with them.
Right.
But there's other people that say, well, that dynamic makes the business much stronger because the whole family's kind of involved. They have kind of the same vision. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, well, it could go either way, of course. But, like most investors, especially venture capital firms, but anyone who's involved and been for a long time in the angel network, you see a lot of deals. You don't have to invest in all of them. So everything else being equally, if there is, I'm not sure I'd call that a red flag because I can get by it. It depends on the relationship and just how much I believe in what they're doing. But if you see something like that you've had a problem with before, then, why bother spending your time and money there? Move on to the next one, which is something I would say as an investor that I would say to everybody, don't worry about the great deals you miss. You're going to miss lots. Some I never hear about. And I read on the news how they had a great exit and they came from Toronto. Like, wow, I wish I had gotten involved. Don't worry about those. You're going to miss lots. You don't have time for all of them. You don't have the money for all of them. Worry about the bad deals that you hit. Those are the problems.
Right. So it's just another vector of risk in your point of view. I think that as well. It's just, here's another risk that you don't need, right?
Yeah,
So just move on.
And there's lots of those. I feel bad picking on husband and wives because, my parents owned a store together. But that's just one example. There could be lots of red flags that you see along the way.
Family in general is a very challenging one, like siblings, for example, that type of thing.
I remember I was helping a company a long time ago, was raising capital, and they are in Winnipeg. And great company. I think they've done very well. The VCs that I spoke to, especially in the U.S., weren't interested in investing in them no matter how good they were because there wasn't a direct flight to Winnipeg or they didn't have a network in Winnipeg that they could rely on. Nothing to do with the company. So, when you look at lots of things, and again, no disrespect to Winnipeg, and things have changed there since this is decades ago, but all right, maybe I see so many things coming out of Toronto, Waterloo, I shouldn't spend my time in Winnipeg.
So I used to be, I used to be the managing director of a corporate VC arm for one of the largest tech companies in the world, Constellation Software. I learned a ton. We always had these internal debates, venture capital success. Does it come from luck? Does it come from proper selection? Does it come from value add? Is it a combination? What do you think?
Well,
what is VCs, like the successful VCs, how do they get there?
Yeah, it is a combination, obviously, of all of those things, but and it's a different answer, perhaps in Canada and the U.S., which I'll talk about. But also, I'm not a venture capital investor. I'm an angel investor in the venture capital world, but I usually work with companies before venture capital, so they're earlier. So there is a larger element of luck. In fact, most of the VCs in Canada or elsewhere, when they start off, if they don't have the capacity to raise a very large fund, then by the size of their fund, they start with earlier stage companies because they're writing smaller checks. Eventually, they either are very good at it and they raise more capital and have to deploy more capital, or they realize that you can still have huge hits by moving up the food chain to later stages where there's less risk and you can see how the company is performing and you can see the traction. So, where I spend most of my time, the luck side of it is probably a bigger thing. The timing is a big thing. I think I've seen some interesting stats that if you just went backwards in time and if you started a venture capital fund at a certain stage in the economy, then their chances of being successful are way better than if you started at a different stage in the economy.
Right. Like 2021 VC funds, like those vintages are garbage.
Well, if you started in 1999 and started investing when everything was falling apart shortly thereafter, or you started in 2002 when it was very hard to find any money, but you were investing at really compressed valuations, you can still find good companies. Just would have been different outcomes in those funds for sure.
Right.
That's a part of it. Now, I mean, of course, VCs spend a lot of their time figuring out, and I've seen a lot of models, what makes a good company. They have a natural intuition for this over time. They also build analytical models, and so presumably they get better at it. They also have some impact on their companies, but I would say for the most part, especially when you're a smaller fund in Canada, you don't have time to go run those companies. You don't have that much time to consult to them. You will help them, but there's only so much you can do, especially if you're deploying money to 10, 15, 20 companies, launching another fund, doing your own fundraising, talking to your own investors. So there's only so much help that you can offer. So in the US, where the funds have now evolved to being much larger, they have more resources to help the companies. There's also funds, because we all know them, who have been around for a while and are successfully known worldwide as being successful funds. When you get to a certain stage, you see more of the better deals because they come to those funds. So you have a bit of an unfair advantage, I would say, but that's the way the world works.
So if you had to choose one of these two elements of success for a VC, let's take a successful VC. Do you think it's more luck or more skill if you had to choose one?
Well, again, at the stage I'm investing in, I would probably lean a little bit more on the luck side. I don't think any VC will say that, of course, but
they have to raise money. They have to justify.
They have to raise money. They have to justify it. Let's look at it a couple of different ways. First of all, we all know that most of the companies that VCs invest in don't end up being, certainly not unicorns, maybe not even successful. So that implies that they don't make all the right picks all the time. Or put another way, if you look at any unicorn and you go back and you hear their story, they will almost always say, we got turned down by 100 VCs before we actually found one that invested on us. So 100 VCs didn't recognize what the one did. How is that possible if they're all smart at finding great companies? There's definitely an element of luck. And just, you don't see every deal either. There's, you're in the right place at the right time, in the right city, and the right category of technology. There's those things are by design, but there's some luck involved in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. The way I've explained it, this is not a fully baked philosophy on this stuff. The way I tend to look at it is VCs, and I think your perspective is also that the more late stage you go, the more skill there is, because the multiples are not as high. In order to make your money back and to justify the risk, you don't need 50x returns. You need 3, 4, 5x, and it changes the more.
Yeah, well, go, right? I mean, if we're just going from seed to Series A, there's still a lot of room of growth for those companies. Right. But you've had a chance to see whether they have product market fit, perhaps, how the team works together. They've maybe hired some key people. I mean, there's quite a bit of risk taken off the table, but relatively speaking, I think the upside potential is still there.
Right.
You're in at a higher valuation, but maybe not that much higher. And by the time the VCs are in, they're also, with a preferred shared structure where they've limited their downside, and there's other things to mitigate the risk.
Right. So the way I look at it is like this. I've described it, again, not fully baked philosophy, but it's more like, so it's either blackjack versus poker. It's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah.
Blackjack is much more luck. You have to know how to play but everyone plays the hands the same. If you know the odds, everyone's going to play the hand the same way, and you're going to win 48% of the time.
Yeah.
That's where the house always wins. But poker is very different. Poker has an element of luck, but poker is very much a skills-based game, right? You have to know how to play the hands. You have to know the odds. So, but there's a way to win. That's why you can have tremendously successful poker players, because they know how to play the game well.
Yeah.
What hands to play, when to play them. They may not choose what hands they get, but once they get those hands, they know how to play them. But you can go all in and still lose, even though the odds are in your favor.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I would look at venture investing. It's you kind of take out 90% of the risk out, but just by following a certain script, by finding the right entrepreneurs in the right places, doing the right diligence, understanding market timing and product market fit and all that. But there's a certain element of, luck. I would call it more, I'm religious, so I believe more that there's much more than luck involved.
Sure.
But there's some things you can't control, is how I would put it. You just can't control certain things. Like, COVID restrictions a few years ago, we invested in a great company that their entire industry went to zero overnight.
Yeah.
You couldn't foresee that, and you can control that. Of course, the right founder can survive something like that, but many can't, and it's not really up to them.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I might change your percentages of the luck and
Yeah,
not
sure.
luck, but you're right. I mean, it's a good analogy. You got to know when to hold them, when to fold them. So apparently, I'm not a great poker player, but a good poker player can play any hand and potentially win. I mean, but if you can have a great hand. If the guy to your right has pocket aces, then there may not be, any way to get through that. Just there's some luck involved for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So I get your endorsement for my philosophy?
Yeah. Of course.
Okay, great. So what would you say is, what's some advice you can give struggling entrepreneurs today? Because a lot of them, they're trying to raise money. It's not an easy environment today. Hopefully it'll get better. But what's some of your advice for them?
Well, it's a tough job, being an entrepreneur. I mean, they know that going into it, but you don't really know it until you actually do it. I would say, first of all, remain connected to why you were doing this in the first place and remind yourself frequently, because presumably you were very passionate about making the decision to become an entrepreneur and, solving a real problem or whatever it is that really drove you. When you're struggling to meet payroll or whatever concerns you have, remind yourself as to the goal and the task and your mission from the start and why you were so passionate about it. That's one thing. I mean, I would say, like I mentioned, surround yourself with great people. We've talked about that. Is to the extent that you can bring on people who are smarter than you, as everyone always says, then you're going to be able to scale your business. A lot of entrepreneurs, one of the problems they have is letting go of things. Now, because they were the person who did everything, they were the one that started, it was their idea, they have ownership, they're probably the biggest investor for a long time. It's difficult to trust somebody else with your baby, but you have to. I mean, you have to survive, which is part of the reason why you bring in great people. So, you should always, as an entrepreneur, be trying to figure out how to not have to do your job anymore. So find someone else to do what you're doing, move on to the next thing that will help grow the company. Because at one time you were responsible for, everything from bookkeeping to sales to customer support. Well, slowly let each one of those things go until you're just the guy out there who's, the cheerleader and raising capital, if you can ever get to that place.
Wow, that's great. I think we can leave off on that very great piece of advice. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And it's awesome.
Great. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.